Okay, so let's see what it means in inheritance in Java. So actually, inheritance in Java is a technique that lets one class inherit um, the data or the methods from another class. So here we have actually two classes. Class number one with all of the variables, with all of the methods, and then we create class number two. So now class number two, what we want is that we want class number two be partially or be completely the same as class number one, right? So here we use the inheritance technique in Java. We say class number one is a superclass, right? Or known as derived or a base class or parent class with all of the methods and all of the data and variables. And then class number two that we want be partially or completely the same as class number one is called subclass or derived class or child class or extended class, right? So that's actually what it means by inheritance in Java. Okay, now you know what it means by inheritance, right? So let's see how we can actually implement that in Java, right? What's the appropriate format or what keyword we need to use in order to implement the inheritance. So here, you need to keep in mind that when you want to use inheritance, you need to use the keyword extends. So here I've showed you two very simple examples, example number one and example number two. In example number one, we have defined one class, class A, public class A, right? So this is a simple class which all of the variables and all of the methods that we have defined, right? So that's the base class. Then we want to create another class, right? Class number two that inherits all of the data and methods from class number A. For example, here we call that class BBB. So how we can uh, define that by using the keyword extends. So the format is public class, the name of that class, class number two, for example here BBB, and then extends, the keyword extends, and after extends you need to write the name of the class number one that has all of the methods and all of the variables and is going to be as a superclass, right? So that's one, the format, the actual format of inheritance. So now you know that you need to use the keyword extends, right? So here you see one simple example. For example, public class employee. That's the base class. And then we say we want to define another class, for example, with the name hourly employee, and we want this class inherits from class employee. So in definition of this class, we need to write public class. The name of that class here is hourly employee extends employee, right? So now by defining hourly employee in this way, we are saying that hourly employee is a class that is going to inherit variables, data, and methods from class named employee. So let's see, for example, when we create two class, and class number one has data and all of the methods, and class number two inherits those data and methods, right? So what about the constructor? So you remember that we used to use constructors in our classes, and then we use those constructors in order to create objects, right? Objects from that special class. So the constructors could have parameters or could have no parameter. So that's about the constructors in general format for the classes, but there is a very important note when a class inherits from another class, and you need to keep it in mind. That's about the constructor of them. So when you create a derived object, the derived class constructor needs to invoke the base class constructor. So that's the point that's very important, and how the derived class constructor can invoke the base class constructor with the keyword super. So as you see here, we have super and then opening parentheses and closing parentheses, and inside the parentheses we have no parameter. Or we can have some parameters and we will put them inside the parentheses. So the super with no parameter inside the parentheses actually invokes base class default constructor, that constructor that has no parameter. And super with parameters inside the parentheses invokes base class constructor with parameters. It means those constructors that have parameters inside the parentheses. So let's see that in a very simple example here to clarify it more and better. For example, we have two classes, employee and hour employee, and hourly employee is the subclass for the superclass employee. So public class hourly employee extends employee, right? And then we have the constructor, for example, hourly employee for this class, as you see here. And we want inside this constructor to invoke the constructor of the superclass. How? By using the keyword super. So super parentheses, as you see here, it can invoke employee constructor. And then we can have another constructor with parameters, for example, hourly employee, double H and double R, right? And inside this constructor, we can use the keyword super with the parameters H and R in order to invoke the employee constructor with two parameters. So that's actually how you can use the keyword super in order to invoke the superclass constructors, right? Another important point is that you also can use super in order to invoke a method from the parent class. And in order to use that, you can follow this format, super dot the name of that method and parameters. So by doing that, you are actually calling the method of the superclass, a method of the superclass, right? By using the keyword super, right? Super dot method and then parentheses. Inside the parentheses, you will write down the parameters. So you remember about modifiers, right? We had public modifiers and private modifiers. So when a method or a data was public, they actually could be accessed by any class, anyone. And when they were private, right, if we defined a data or a method to be private, then that data or that method could just be accessed by the class that they are in. So we learned about private and public modifiers. So here we have another kind of modifier which is protected, and when we specify a member to be protected, then it can be accessed by any class that is in the same package. So that's the difference between protected modifier and private and public modifier. So we have another modifier which is final. So I think you remember from the previous sessions I mentioned that we can use this modifier, this keyword, when we want to make, for example, a variable to be constant. So when you use this keyword in a declaration of a variable and then assign the value to that variable, that value was completely fixed during the program. We could not change that value. So we can, what I want to say here is that we can use this modifier in declaration of a class or in declaration of a method as well. So if you use this modifier in declaration of a class, it means that class cannot be extended. What it means by it cannot be extended, it means it cannot be parent of any class, right? So you cannot use that class with modifier final to for example, for inheritance at all. So that's about using this modifier in the declaration of a class. The other point is when you use this modifier in the declaration of a method, then that method cannot be overridden in a subclass. It means that method is a final version of the method, right? So these are two important points that you need to keep in mind when you use the modifier final in declaration of a class and in declaration of a method.